Hello and welcome to Aimless Ramblings. This is once again the podcast where myself, my brother Simon, and my friend Sam have discussions about numerous different topics. And today it's Sam's opportunity to vent on a particular topic, so I'll throw to him.
G'day all. I figured I would use the catalyst or that little grain of sand to act as the irritant and the pell of this conversation. To formulate around is a line from my Anglo-Saxon poem, The Wanderer. I cannot remotely speak Anglo-Saxon, so any of you out there that can, I don't really care. But Wyrd bith full āræd, as far as I can figure it out, which is essentially like fate is wholly inexorable. So this kind of came about in part because I was having a discussion with a colleague of mine, the famous where do you see yourself in 5 years conversation. And my response essentially was, look, I didn't expect to be here 5 years ago, but 5 years before that I didn't expect to be there, We make plans as such, but life always, has a bit of a way of coming in and changing that. And so I was thinking, it kind of ties in with the concept that most historic societies have had of this concept of essentially a deity of fate. So we live in a world that's just far too complex for us to actually be able to understand. So you've got Wyrd in this context being the Germanic and Saxon goddess for fate, Fortuna in the Romance languages. So essentially just we have no fucking control, but somehow we kind of are okay with that fact, and just struck me as an interesting, concept to dance on, that we've got nothing, but we seem surprisingly okay with that. What do you reckon, Simon?
No, I definitely agree. There's this whole entire concept that, if I do this, then this will happen, and therefore I'll have this result, that perfect world, but they assume that that's just already foretold, that will happen.
Yeah, like, I'm a good boy, I'll whatever, get married, buy a house, be successful,
Yeah. Or, I study this thing, so therefore I'll become... Oh, yep. Tim?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it points to the somewhat tragically optimistic nature of humans. If we weren't, I think we'd all probably throw ourselves off cliffs. But it's something in the heart, like, we have to think that there is a very simple causal relationship, because in the immediate here and now, I suppose this is an evolutionary drive, this is why it exists, that pushes us to actually, drive after things and try to achieve them. Whereas in reality, both society and the world that we live in is a really complex system, which, just like with chaos theory, you put in one input, the actual system itself is largely a black box to us, and the outputs don't really seem to have any sort of causal logical relation to that initial input. Simon, sorry?
Yeah, so you were talking about the evolutionary, bias on actually positivity. That's actually the whole basis of depression. Depression's actually ultra-realism, so it's where we don't have all these... We don't have all the positives built in that go, oh, wow, I'm not going to be hit by a car because, I believe I'm not going to be hit by a car. But in depression, you get every single one of those outputs. It's like, are you sure? There's a risk if you do that. But, it's never turned off. That's obviously major depressive disorder, but yeah, that's pretty much what depression is ultra-realism.
Fair enough.
Thank God for evolutionary biology.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's like the classic one, like, if I'm texting while I'm driving, I'm not going to crash my car, but if you don't buy a lottery ticket, you got to be in it to win it, sort of stuff, so...
Yeah. Funny shit.
So, Sam, I would like to say is, on top of that as well, I think that we are really good at post-fact creating a coherent narrative out of our lives that makes it seem like life is causally related. Like, in a sense that, like, I can look back at my current career that I'm in, and I look back through my schooling, and it feels like, those things sort of married up with each other, one after another, when in reality, I can't even tell which position I'm going to be posted to, like, the year after or the year after that. And sometimes I don't even know I'm doing month from month. So I definitely think there is a post hoc bias towards finding coherence in what we've done?
Yeah, there's definitely like, looking back, everything makes sense. Personally, I sort of see fate as sort of a continuation forwards, but I guess you could post hoc say something was fate. But,
True,
yeah.
I guess like we technically only ever exist in the past, right? Any processing that takes place is assuming that the concept of linear time is factual, whatever. Fuck off scientists. We only ever exist in the past, and so therefore we'll only ever can view backwards, if that makes sense. Like the point you're making, Tim. We notice a pattern in what's happened, and so assume that means there's a pattern going forward, but that's just because we're really fucking good at finding patterns.
Once
This
again,
is a really
drawing
like,
back
cheerful topic.
pretty much. I mean, what is it? And it all draws back to that sort of evolutionary biology and the idea of coherence is necessary for us to form some form of personhood. Because otherwise, like, how do you coalesce all of the contradictory thoughts, factors, and actions we've taken throughout our lives?
Yeah. Interesting you say that, because like in society at least, there's so many incredibly strong biological drivers that we're completely capable of overriding. Say like reproduction, right? Plenty of people out there choose not to reproduce, which is arguably the strongest biological driver, and yet we as a society don't seem to be able to. Well, even just me individually, like it doesn't seem to be able to come to terms with the fact of a chaotic and meaningless universe.
I think, well, some might be able to speak to this more, but I think that like that sense of a need for meaning and a drive towards meaning is significantly something that affects people's motivation and their willingness to participate in society. And as soon as a society's coherent narrative is attacked, criticized, or disproven, that unfortunately, because of the nature of humanity and the nature of psychology, it can never kind of become a vacuum. New narratives raise up and sort of absorb that space.
So as you were talking, you talked about how there's that like uncontrollable need to have reproduce. What actually usually happens in a lot of cases is what they do is they just get that need to like create, and they just sort of put in a different like sort of direction. It's sort of like, that thing of like redirecting effort. And it's the same with biological needs. I remember having a discussion with Tim. He was like talking about, I just want to get rid of the lizard brain. And I'm like, well, you would do none of the things that you do if you got rid of your lizard brain. He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well,
it's my best friend as well. The number of times that's got me home drunk. God bless the lizard brain.
Yeah, exactly. And it's great because people go, oh, well, it has all these like but even though most like intellectual concept goes back to a lizard brain concept, so people go, oh, well, I don't need my lizard brain because I create papers. I'm like, but why do you create papers? And they're like, oh, to gain knowledge and power. I'm like, but why do you really make the papers? They're like, yeah, because I get satisfaction out of it. I'm like, cool. Well, that's a lizard brain concept.
Okay, so yeah, I think you raised a real good point though, Simon. Is like it's not a mistake on my perception that people aren't necessarily actually overriding that biological driver, like you said. They're just redirecting it, and maybe there is just no redirection for the desire to have an order to our life.
I was going to say, does that mean Freud was right, Simon? Like, human emotions are just hydraulic, and if you stunt them in one way, they're going to emerge in another potentially damaging, or in this case of redirection of creative energies, potentially more productive manner.
I know this is bait, and 100%. I know you had to bring out Freud with his, but obviously with everything, he was sort of the first step into that sort of mind palace area of psychology. But like as they've moved forwards, they've definitely seen that life finds a way. So even you think, oh well, I stunt the growth in like the best example of, as you were discussing, the stunting of things was there was a Romanian orphan study. So there was like so many orphans born, yet their children, I think their parents either put them up for adoption or they died. Their parents died, so they were all put in this thing, and it was interesting to see how quickly they could bounce back developmentally, because there was only like 5 nurses to like 500 children, so they couldn't actually interact with every single one of them and give them that interaction. And it was really interesting to see that, like, I think it was under the age of like 5, they were able to regain the ability to do socially normal things and were fine. But past the age of 5, there was like some notable weird tics that they had, and I feel like that was sort of them trying. Like, the most common one that you probably have seen in a lot of things is that rocking backwards and forwards, which is, as phallically as it sounds, it's called self-stimulation.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah, and it's when you can't find something external to assist you, you create something external. So it's you rocking backwards and forwards, giving yourself, like, some form of output or input that, like, makes you feel like you're truly in control, which really feeds back into this whole fate thing, that it's like, if we're born in a vacuum where we don't actually have any interaction, we still try and find something that makes us feel connected with reality.
Yeah. So yeah, it really does sound like it's biologically, for lack of a better term, driven concept. You know, have you got science behind it, Tim? Quantum style?
Certainly. So in terms of fate and this real dialect that has existed since very early on in science and philosophy and natural philosophy before it has been between the ideas of determinism and free will. And it's pretty easy to see why, from a philosophy and particularly from an ethics side, why free will has always been a pretty big argument that people have gone after, because from a moral sense, if an individual's actions are determined, then it's very difficult to logically ascribe praise and blame in any meaningful ethical sense to an action that is essentially was going to occur regardless. So the individual had no control over it. It was predetermined. And we've actually seen recently, like even the Atlantic released an article called "Famous Argument Against Free Will Has Been Debunked." Yeah. So what you had this experiment called the Liebert experiment, where you had basically an individual who was attempting to show that the neural correlates of mental activity were actually predating the conscious decision of the mind to make a decision. And it essentially it wasn't initially meant to do that, but it ended up being used as evidence of determinism, the idea that a brain had already come to the decision before you were consciously aware of it. And most recently, it seems, at least on the surface, that it may have actually been debunked, and it's actually just the mind going through the process of warming up to the point to make a decision, as opposed to actually making the decision prior to the decision consciously being made. But what is interesting is that even with this particular argument being debunked, and a lot of people now running around saying, well, it looks like free will's back on the menu, it doesn't really handle the sort of causal chain argument of hard determinism, like materialism and materialistic determinism. So historically, this is really simple before quantum physics came and ruined everything for everybody, Sam.
Right. Worst mistake we've made as a species.
Definitely. But basically, the idea, like if you look at Newtonian corpuscular physics, and the idea there of, you can essentially have billiard balls of the smallest level molecule or atom bouncing off each other. You can theoretically be like Laplace's demon. If you understand the exact location of all objects and their velocity at any stage, you can then predict forwards and back everything that is occurring across the entirety of the universe. So in that case, that would be a materialistically determined universe. However, with quantum mechanics and the fact that you have particles existing in superstates and then collapsing into one or the other state after the fact, and as what seems at this stage, there is no underlying hidden variable which determines which one of those superstates the actual particle occupies, that would suggest that you can't actually have determinism at the lowest level. Which is that subparticle, elementary particle level. And the reason why that's important is because we've already talked about chaos theory once in this particular episode, But if you have, even at the lowest level, some form of indeterminacy, that would indicate that there's actually still indeterminacy at the macro level, because those tiny, minute changes can have massive effects at the macro level. What I will say, though, is that all of these arguments against determinism still doesn't solve the causal argument for determinism. So even if we live in only a probabilistic universe that's not neurally determined as far as we can tell, the fact of the matter is that if your free will is in the decisions you're making are based upon your psychological conditioning, so behavioral psychology based off of pretty much all of this, as well as your environment, at what point is there some interaction with some other object that exists outside of that conditioning, being environmental, as in like your biological, essentially your genetics and how that forms your mind, and what Gestalt psychology will call the mind itself, and the conditioning that you go throughout your life, like the old nature versus nurture debate. If nothing exists outside that, then how can you actually make a free decision? Because it's all just based on conditioning.
Yeah, which is essentially just determinism, you know? It goes straight back to fate. Like, if we have a choice, you know, but there's actually only one choice to be made, then there's not a choice. You know, we may... Is it like the little dude thinking he's driving the car, but steering wheel's not actually hooked up to nothing?
Yeah, exactly, like a paper plate in your hands.
Yeah, the only issue when it comes to determinism, and this whole entire concept that there's one solution, is brought up by several different concepts. The first one that comes to mind is two very different areas. One's goat tracks, which is this concept in architecture where when designing routes from one location to another location, a lot of times they'll get it wrong, and you'll be able to notice like these dead parts of grass where people are creating their own little track. And because one person, and that also feeds into broken window theory, which is if there's a perfectly fine building, most people will walk past and not even think about it. But if somebody throws a rock through a window, it becomes much more tempting to just throw another rock through the window because it's already broken. So me doing more damage is not really going to do anything. It's already broken as a concept. And then, like, if we're preordained to do something, the instance, like, somebody else does something, does that change our fate? And, like, if we're going to do that, then, like, does that mean every person we meet affects our fate? And then does it even become fate at the end of it?
Well, yeah. This is the interesting thing I would say is that, so hard material determinism in terms of like some sort of Calvinist idea of a predetermined outcome in the universe, I think has been relatively debunked because of quantum mechanics. But I would definitely agree that the act of conditioning and your genetic potential, and then on top of that, the socially specific and environmentally specific location that you're in at any one time, essentially sort of probabilistically determines what you're going to do, if you know what I mean. So the thing is that...
but some people won't throw that rock through a window. That's the thing.
Correct. But the thing is what I would say is it's similar to the twin slit experiment, right? So if you take... if you're observing the photons as they're coming through the twin split, they're going to come out as individual photons, and they're going to punch onto the screen behind it. If you're not observing it, or if you're not, once again, observing it here is a pretty loose term because we're talking about instrumentation, but if you're not observing it, it forms a wave-like pattern. But the thing is that if you are observing it, the actual, it seems random at first when those photons are hitting the screen behind, but if you actually just let enough of them come through, it actually still forms that wave-like pattern on the back wall on that screen. So the individual action might seem random, but it's kind of like radioactive decay, right? Exactly, like radioactive decay. Like I can't tell you in the half-life of an object. I can't tell you with a radioactive substance which particular atom is going to decay at any one moment. What I can tell you,
you've only got one of them.
Yeah, correct. But what I can tell you is obviously after the half-life of that particular substance has been expended, there's only going to be half of it left.
But which half? That's the question.
Logically, like, so I deal primarily with, like, biology, right? And on the biological scale, science is incredibly deterministic. Otherwise, it just would not fucking work, you know? You got to do the same thing, and if the same thing doesn't happen because of me doing the same thing, why would I be bothering doing it? So, I understand there's the what's it called, Tim? You know what it's called. The unseen variable? Unseen variable?
So yeah, there is, at least there appears to be in quantum mechanics, no unseen variable which determines the likelihood of it collapsing in one way or the other.
Yeah. So it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, most of quantum mechanics doesn't, but it just doesn't seem to vibe with the whole feel of the Constitution as such. That there's nothing out there that we're missing. Like, surely if we have, you know, this huge body of scientific work, and then this one thing doesn't seem to fit into it, it seems very strange to say, okay, everything else is wrong. It's actually just all chaos and we made up a pattern. Instead of going, could it be that there's actually just something we're failing to miss? I mean, it could be it exists in a dimension that we can't even fucking interact with.
True.
But it just seems like such a preemptive statement to make.
As I said, from what we know now at this stage.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, as soon as you find this variable, you can present it and get your Nobel Prize in Physics, Sam.
Yeah, right? Nah, man, you cruel assassinate me.
Sorry, Simon?
Yeah, it's the good old adage that, you know, a broken clock is correct twice a day. That's the sort of vibe I get from, like, the Fate. Yeah, so there was a fraternal twin slash the other one where they're not. Anyway, they did some studies where they had them in two separate families. Very unethical nowadays, but at the time it was, you know, all
the good sciences.
Yeah. And it was just really interesting seeing how if you give two people the exact same toolbox, how you can get two very different outcomes. Like in some cases, there was like two that both became murderers in two different states with a similar kind of style. But then you had one particular one, which was one of my favorites, which was one guy became a jewelry thief. The other guy became a high-ranking officer in the police. Because they used the same tools they were given in two very different ways. And then it's like, so you're like, oh, well, you know, that must be. So are they both fated to be police? Are they both fated to be cops? Like.
Well, I mean, if you take like the We'd Be Full āræd, whatever the fuck it is, you know, they were both fated to be what they are.
And you know what I would say is that once again, unfortunately, both our genetic predisposition and our moment-to-moment interactions with the physical world in which we live in is once again one of those kind of complex theory systems where you have essentially a black box because we perceive tiny minute amount of it, and when we put an input into that system, and the thing is like what caused us to put that input into the system, I'd say the inputs into ourselves, and therefore our outputs are realistically determined. But the thing is that, yeah, we're modifying that system and the system is modifying us simultaneously, but we don't really have a good understanding of what that sort of feedback loop is because there's too many inputs and there's too many outputs and we don't really understand how they all mesh together in that black box. So the fate part is really the fact that we're being conditioned by all of these environmental inputs on top of the existing genetic framework, and then the decisions that we make are determined by that before. So whether that be like I have a predisposition towards crime, but then throughout my life I'm sort of, well, I'm going to be predisposed to crime. I might just be somebody that's willing to take risks, who is slightly more aggressive or something like that. And then in the right conditions, that leads to me being a sports champion. Wrong conditions, that leads to me breaking into houses. Yes, Simon?
So black box, are we talking about the neural highway in that respect?
Like the big lump of grey matter in here.
Yeah, so I'm guessing when you're talking about predeterminism and whatnot, you're talking about like the road most traveled. So it's like what's most easy for us to travel neurologically. Like, oh yeah, So, or obviously PTSD is when it works really badly, and when it's like, oh wow, yeah, so you want this, so you also want this information, right? And it's no longer a goat's track, it's like a superhighway between the two. But even those connections can be broken. So does that, therefore, were they fated to break that?
Well, the thing is who's breaking that? If it's somebody else, or if we're seeking it because it's causing obviously bad issues in our lives, and we have people intervening in our lives to help us, their decision to intervene in our lives is caused by the conditioning that they received in their lives. So the actors are all predetermined. I mean, like, even if the outcomes aren't necessarily.
So, interestingly, enthalpy, right? A system should degrade toward chaos, right?
Well, lower level energy state.
Yeah, which is, fair, lower energy state. So, one would argue that versus prehistory, our society is more structured and probably existing in a higher energy state. So if the universe is deterministic, enthalpy is going to be most likely the primary driver, right? So how do we go uphill in terms of complexity? Which we have. Like, society today is far more complex than it was.
So you can have a reduction in local entropy. I mean, that's exactly how refrigeration works, right? So, but what I would also say is that we aren't in a closed system. Like, we have massive amounts of energy being pumped out of the sun every second, and that's being pumped into the system that is Earth. So the thing is at the local level, you can have an increase in energy density and an increase in complexity. But the thing is, what is happening overall, if you look at the solar system as a net sort of product and a net system, it's losing energy every second, because as the sun burns through its processes, it's chewing up its lifespan.
Yeah. Sun. Yeah.
Yeah, basically.
Bloody sun.
So, Simon, you had something to say as well about destiny and fate more broadly, didn't you?
Okay, so we were talking about the world and all that general thing. There's a really nice quote I'm going to start it with, which is, "Destiny, what does a boy know of destiny? If a fish lives its whole life in the river, does it know the river's destiny? No, only that it runs on and on, out of control. He may follow where it flows, but he cannot see the end. He cannot imagine the ocean." And I feel that's the same with fate and, like, destiny, as I like to call it. We were talking about fate, like, oh, wow, everybody was fated to help us, but, like, does our fate override the fate of the universe, the Earth? And that leads also into, I was talking about cold reading, which I think I brought up throughout, where this whole entire thing of, like, confirmation bias, that if we're told you will have a great experience, you will find something that happened to you and go, oh wow, that was my great experience that I was fated to have. Same with negative experiences, like, you will have a death somewhere, and you're like, oh shit, that bird died, that was my death, oh god. Or, oh, my grandparent, she was really sickly, but they fated that she was going to die, so she's died, so this is the fates. And it's just always that. And then it's like, hypothetically, if I said, oh, I'm fated to become a businessman, but then it came September 11 and I died, was I fated to die, or was I fated to, get the boss's position? Because that was what I was socially conditioned to do. And does fate end the instant you die, or does your fate continue past your expiration date through the people that knew you? They're like, oh, well, now we're fated to continue on his fate. And it's like, where do you draw the line?
True, well, you'd have to ask Wyrd.
Well, I think actually that links back really well into two different things we've already talked about. So the first is coherence, which is how we always want to try and find a coherent strand in what happens to us so that things seem to have meaning. But also it links back into that idea of determinism. So the impact that if we see ourselves as an individual person, as in completely separated from the system, then to us, we kind of think of our own minds as transparent, like, even though they're not really. But the idea that thoughts come in, thoughts and words go out. But at the same time, if we look at ourselves as part of a system, as merely a cog, and maybe if you want to talk about a metamind or a sort of societal neural network, our thoughts and then through our communications with others are influencing and conditioning other brains. So realistically, we're just very similar to like individual modules in the mind talking to each other, creating the emergent property of mind. Well, little modules of the brain talking to each other and making the emergent property of mind. Very similar. Humans themselves are just little modules talking to each other, creating the emergent property of a society.
Exactly.
Yeah. Some food for thought.
Well, anyway, unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, Dan. That was actually quite an interesting discussion. So hopefully next time we'll pick an equally interesting debate topic.
Yeah, it should be good. Difficult one to talk about, especially because I think we all are effectively in agreement. But yeah.
All right. Well, until next time, catch you later.